The old house. The story begins with a young couple, Ethan and Claire, moving into an old remote house they purchased for a surprisingly low price. The house was large, with creaking wooden floors and a sense of history. The previous owners left abruptly, leaving behind old furniture and even family photos. The couple thought it was their dream home. But from the first night, strange things began to happen. The sound of footsteps echoed in the halls, even though no one was there. The air grew unnaturally cold in certain rooms. One night, Ethan discovered a hidden door in the basement. Behind it was a staircase leading to a smaller, windowless room. The room contained a single rocking chair, a diary, and a mirror covered with a dusty sheet. Claire began reading the diary, which belonged to a girl named Annabelle, who lived in the house decades ago. The entries were unsettling, describing how Annabelle's family had been haunted by the uninvited guests, entities that lurked in the shadows, mimicking family members' voices and movements. Annabelle wrote about how her family began to change. Her father became violent, her mother despondent, and her brother vanished without a trace. The final entry read, "They want me now. I can hear them calling my name through the mirror." That night, Claire woke up to hear Ethan calling her from downstairs. But when she went to investigate, Ethan was asleep in bed. The couple decided to remove the mirror from the hidden room. As they lifted it, they noticed their reflections didn't move in sync. Their reflections smiled when they didn't. Horrified, they covered it again and decided to call a priest the next day. That night, the disturbances escalated. Doors slammed, furniture moved on its own, and whispers echoed through the house. Claire heard a voice that sounded like her late mother, pleading for help. Ethan saw a figure that looked like himself, staring at him from the corner of their bedroom. When the priest arrived, he refused to enter the house, saying it was tainted. He advised them to leave immediately. Ethan and Claire packed their belongings, but as they tried to leave, the front door wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't break. It was as if the house had trapped them. The whispers grew louder, turning into screams. Claire was dragged into the hidden room by an unseen force. Ethan followed, only to see her standing in front of the uncovered mirror. She turned to him, but her face wasn't hers anymore. It was Annabelle's. Ethan tried to pull her away, but she disappeared into the mirror. In desperation, he smashed the mirror, but instead of shattering, it absorbed him. Weeks later, a real estate agent listed the house again, describing it as a beautiful property with a lot of character. A new family moved in, and the cycle began anew. The last shot of the video shows the hidden room, where the mirror stands untouched, and faint whispers echo in the background. Months after Ethan and Claire disappeared, the house was purchased by a family of 4, the Martins. Daniel and Lisa, along with their 2 children, Sophie, 16, and Max, 8, were eager for a fresh start after a tumultuous year. The real estate agent had mentioned nothing about the house's sinister past. The family quickly settled in, but Sophie, an introverted teenager, felt uneasy from the start. She found herself drawn to the basement, where she discovered the hidden room. The mirror, now slightly cracked, seemed to emit a faint hum. Sophie thought she heard whispers calling her name when she stood near it. Max, meanwhile, began talking to an imaginary friend named Annabelle. At first, the parents dismissed it as a phase. But when Max started drawing disturbing pictures of shadowy figures surrounding the family, Lisa grew concerned. One evening, Daniel heard faint laughter echoing through the halls, even though everyone else was asleep. He followed the sound to the basement, where he found Sophie sitting in the hidden room, staring at the mirror. Her reflection seemed different, Her eyes were darker, and her expression was vacant. When Daniel shook her, she snapped out of it, but couldn't remember how she got there. The incident unnerved him, but he didn't mention it to Lisa, thinking it was just teenage sleepwalking. That night, the family experienced their first collective disturbance. Doors slammed shut on their own, lights flickered, and Max screamed, claiming Annabelle was angry. Lisa found scratches on the walls, spelling out words like "stay" and "mine." The family brought in a paranormal investigator, a middle-aged woman named Evelyn, who specialized in cleansing haunted houses. As soon as Evelyn entered the house, she froze, sensing the overwhelming malevolent energy. She warned the family that the house was not haunted, it was alive. Evelyn explained that the mirror was a portal to a place where entities fed on fear and despair. Destroying it wouldn't help. The house itself was the source of the evil. She performed a ritual to weaken the connection, but during the process, the mirror cracked further, releasing a dark, shadowy figure into the room. The entity attacked Evelyn, throwing her across the room. Before fleeing the house, she warned the family that they had to leave immediately or risk being consumed by the house's power. As the Martins packed to leave, the house fought back. The front door slammed shut, locking them inside. The windows became impenetrable. Sophie was lured to the basement by a voice mimicking her father, and when Daniel went after her, he saw multiple versions of himself reflected in the mirror, each one grinning maniacally. Lisa and Max tried to escape through the second-floor window, but shadowy hands emerged from the walls, pulling them back. In the basement, Sophie confronted the entity. It revealed itself as Annabelle, who explained that she had become a part of the house after her family's demise. The house needed a new family to sustain its power, and the Martins were perfect candidates. Daniel fought to free Sophie, smashing the mirror with a heavy wrench. This time, the mirror shattered, but instead of breaking the curse, it unleashed all the trapped souls. The house began to collapse as the spirits filled the air, screaming in anguish. The family barely escaped as the house crumbled to the ground. But as they stood outside, they noticed Max clutching something, a shard of the mirror. His reflection in the shard smiled back at him, even as his real face remained expressionless. The screen fades to black, with faint whispers echoing, "The house is never truly gone." The Martins moved into a temporary apartment after the house's destruction, trying to put the horrifying experience behind them. But the atmosphere remained tense. Max, once cheerful, had become eerily quiet, spending hours staring at the shard of the mirror he had secretly kept. Sophie, who had been closest to the haunting, began having vivid nightmares. She dreamed of the house rebuilding itself, room by room, brick by brick. In every dream, Annabelle stood at the center, whispering, "Bring them back." One night, Lisa woke up to find Max missing from his bed. Panicking, she searched the apartment and found him sitting in the darkened kitchen, staring into the shard. The reflection showed not just Max, but shadowy figures looming behind him. When Lisa tried to take the shard away, Max growled in a voice that wasn't his. "It's mine." Sophie decided to investigate the shard. She reached out to Evelyn, the paranormal investigator who had helped them earlier. Evelyn, though injured and hesitant, agreed to examine the shard. Evelyn discovered that the shard was not just a remnant of the mirror. It was a piece of the house itself, carrying its malevolent energy. Through it, the house was slowly rebuilding its influence, using Max as its vessel. Evelyn warned that if they didn't act soon, Max's soul could be consumed entirely, and the house would rise again. Max's behavior grew more disturbing. He began drawing intricate plans of the house, detailing rooms that had never existed before. He whispered to unseen entities and refused to eat or sleep. The family realized that the shard was amplifying the house's power. Evelyn proposed a dangerous ritual to sever the shard's connection to the house. The ritual required the family to return to the site of the house's ruins and bury the shard at its heart. But the ritual would also awaken whatever remained of the house's spirits, making it a life-threatening endeavor. Reluctantly, the Martins agreed. They returned to the desolate lot, which now felt unnaturally cold and lifeless. As Evelyn began the ritual, the ground trembled, and the air filled with the sounds of whispers and distant screams. Shadowy figures emerged from the darkness, attacking the family. Daniel fought them off with a flashlight, which seemed to repel the entities temporarily. Sophie and Lisa held Max, who was writhing and screaming as if something inside him was trying to break free. As Evelyn chanted, Annabelle's ghost appeared, her face twisted in rage. She screamed at Sophie, accusing her of breaking the mirror and ruining her home. Annabelle tried to grab the shard, but Sophie stood her ground, yelling, "You don't own us." The ground cracked open, revealing the remnants of the hidden room buried beneath the ruins. Evelyn instructed Sophie to throw the shard into the chasm, but Max broke free, grabbing the shard and running toward the pit. Lisa and Daniel chased after him, pleading for him to stop. At the edge of the chasm, Max hesitated, his eyes flickering between his own and something darker. Sophie stepped forward and begged her brother to fight the house's influence. In a moment of clarity, Max whispered, "I'm sorry," and threw the shard into the pit. The ground shook violently as the shard shattered upon impact, releasing a blinding light. The shadowy figures screamed and dissolved into the air. Annabelle's ghost let out one final wail before disappearing. The family barely escaped as the ground sealed itself, leaving no trace of the house or the hidden room. Weeks later, the Martins began to heal, though the scars of their ordeal remained. Max returned to his cheerful self, but Sophie often caught him staring at his reflection, as if searching for something. One evening, Sophie found a drawing Max had hidden under his bed. It was a picture of their family, standing in front of the house, perfectly intact, with Annabelle smiling in the window. The screen fades to black, with the faint sound of a child's laughter echoing. The house is never truly gone. Months passed, and the Martins tried to return to a normal life, but strange occurrences began anew. Max started having vivid nightmares of the house, its halls stretching endlessly, filled with whispers. He often woke up screaming, claiming Annabelle was calling him back. Sophie, too, felt the pull. One night, she dreamed she was standing in the ruins of the house, but instead of destruction, the house stood tall and whole again. Annabelle stood at the front door, holding the shard of the mirror Max had thrown into the chasm. She smiled and whispered, "We're waiting for you." Lisa and Daniel dismissed these events as lingering trauma, but when objects in their apartment began moving on their own, and shadowy figures appeared in their reflections, they realized the nightmare wasn't over. Evelyn returned to help the family once again, though she looked visibly weakened. She explained that the house was not just a structure. It was an entity, feeding on fear and despair. Destroying the mirror and the shard had only delayed its return. The house was rebuilding itself in the spiritual realm, and once complete, it would manifest in the physical world. Annabelle, now fully consumed by the house's power, was its vessel. Evelyn warned that if the house fully returned, It would spread its curse far beyond its original location. To stop the house, the family needed to destroy its core, a spiritual nexus buried deep within the land where the house once stood. However, the core was heavily guarded by the entities trapped in the house. Evelyn led the family back to the ruins, where the land now seemed alive. The air was heavy, and the ground pulsed faintly as if breathing. Evelyn set up a protective circle and began the ritual to locate the core. As the ritual progressed, the ruins transformed around them. The house began to reassemble itself piece by piece, walls rising and rooms forming. The family found themselves trapped inside the house once more, though it felt more malevolent than before. Shadowy figures emerged from the walls, their forms distorted and grotesque. The family fought to stay together as they navigated the endless halls, guided by Evelyn's chants. In the heart of the house, they found the core, a pulsating dark mass that seemed alive. Annabelle stood before it, her face blank, but her eyes filled with rage. She accused the family of trying to destroy her home and demanded they leave. Evelyn instructed the family to weaken the core by confronting their deepest fears. The house fed on their guilt, shame, and sorrow, and they needed to resist its influence. Lisa faced the loss of her mother, whose voice echoed through the halls, begging her to stay. Daniel confronted his guilt over a failed business venture that had led them to buy the house. Sophie faced Annabelle directly, realizing that Annabelle wasn't entirely evil. She was a victim of the house's power. Max, however, was the key. Annabelle revealed that Max's innocence made him the perfect vessel for the house's rebirth. But Sophie, stepping in front of her brother, declared, "You can't have him. You've taken enough." In a moment of courage, Max threw a small object he'd kept hidden, a drawing he'd made of the family escaping the house, into the core. The drawing began to glow, and the core started to crack. The house screamed in fury as the walls crumbled. Annabelle let out a heart-wrenching cry before dissolving into light, finally free from the house's grasp. Evelyn completed the ritual, and the core shattered, sending out a shockwave that destroyed the house once and for all. The family emerged from the ruins, exhausted but alive. Evelyn, weakened by the ritual, told them the house was gone forever, but its scars would remain. As they drove away, Sophie glanced back at the ruins one last time. In the distance, she thought she saw a faint figure, a little girl waving goodbye. The screen fades to black with a final whisper. "Thank you." The Martins had finally started to rebuild their lives. Sophie excelled in school. Max was slowly returning to his cheerful self, and Lisa and Daniel focused on strengthening their family bond. Despite this, a lingering unease remained. Sophie began to notice strange things, objects subtly moving, shadows flickering at the edges of her vision, and a persistent feeling of being watched. She dismissed them as remnants of trauma, until one evening when she heard faint whispers coming from Max's room. When she entered, she found Max sitting cross-legged, staring at a blank page in his sketchbook. The page began to darken as if invisible hands were sketching. Slowly, an image of the house began to appear. Max turned to Sophie, his voice hollow. "She's not gone. She's waiting." Sophie decided to visit Evelyn, only to find her home empty. The neighbors informed her that Evelyn had fallen into a coma shortly after helping the family destroy the house. Left with no guidance, Sophie began researching the history of the land where the house once stood. Her search led her to a man named Arthur Kane, an elderly historian who had studied the property for decades. Arthur revealed that the land was cursed long before the house was built. A cult, had used the site for rituals to summon an ancient entity known as the Dweller, a being that fed on fear and suffering. The house had been a vessel for this entity, and though the physical structure was destroyed, its essence remained tethered to the land, and now to Max. Max's behavior grew more erratic. He began sleepwalking, muttering in an unknown language, and creating detailed drawings of the house's rooms, each one more twisted and distorted than the last. One night, he disappeared, though the family searched frantically, eventually finding him at the site of the house's ruins. To their horror, the ground had begun to shift, and faint outlines of the house's foundation were visible. Max stood in the center, staring at the earth, as if listening to something only he could hear. Sophie approached him cautiously, and Max turned to her, his eyes black. "It's coming back," he said in a voice that wasn't his own. Desperate to save Max, Sophie returned to Arthur, who provided her with an ancient ritual to sever the Dweller's connection to their family. The ritual required a relic from the original cult, a stone altar buried deep beneath the ruins. With no other option, Sophie, Lisa, and Daniel returned to the site. As they dug, the air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder. They unearthed the altar, a grotesque stone slab covered in ancient symbols. Max appeared, now fully possessed by the Dweller's influence. Shadowy figures emerged from the ground, their forms more terrifying than before. They surrounded the family, their distorted faces showing expressions of anguish and rage. Sophie began the ritual, reading from Arthur's notes. The shadows attacked, and the family fought desperately to protect her. As the ritual progressed, Max screamed, his voice blending with the entity's guttural roars. The altar began to glow, and the shadows recoiled, but the Dweller's essence resisted. Sophie realized the ritual required a sacrifice. Someone had to offer themselves to seal the entity permanently. Before Sophie could act, Evelyn appeared, her frail body glowing faintly. Though weak, she took over the ritual, chanting with a power that seemed to come from beyond. She looked at Sophie and whispered, "Take care of your brother." Evelyn completed the ritual, and the Dweller let out an ear-piercing scream as it was pulled into the altar. The ground shook violently, and the shadows dissolved into the air. Evelyn collapsed, her body turning to ash as the altar sealed itself, the symbols fading into the stone. The final goodbye. The Martins stood in silence as the site grew still. Sophie picked up a small locket that had belonged to Evelyn, now lying where she had stood. As they left the ruins for the final time, Max whispered to Sophie, "She saved us." Months later, the family visited Evelyn's grave, leaving flowers and the locket as a token of gratitude. Though the ordeal was over, Sophie occasionally felt a presence watching over them. Not malevolent, but protective. The screen fades to black, with a soft voice echoing, "Some stories end, but their echoes remain."